Alright, to continue on with our Stephen King series, we're going to go back to Nightmares and Dreamscapes and touch on an episode of the increasingly underwhelming miniseries that bears its name. And this time I think we're going to talk about Crouch End, which actually was the second episode, I think, because it premiered like one right after the other with Battleground on the first night that it aired. And if I remember correctly, it was clear to a lot of people that after Battleground, which was so well done, and was one of the way earlier ones we talked about in the series, this one was a significant invisible drop in quality. And a lot of people noticed that, especially immediately following Battleground. So, yeah, I don't know where the decision came to book these episodes in this particular order, but that's what happened. And is when you look at it also, the fact that it's basically King wanting to go in a Lovecraft sort of approach. And the story definitely does do that up basically to the point that not only is there like, you know, some name dropping towards the end that really spells that out, but he just drops Lovecraft's name very early into the story. Like it's not even necessarily like, I mean, obviously it's an homage, I guess, but it's in all these things where it's like, well, we were kind of somewhat going for this. They just straight up say the name Lovecraft very early in the story to make it apparent that that's what the feel is going for. And so when you take that into account, before you even know the story itself and the directions that it goes, just taking that little nugget of information by itself, you might wonder how they thought they could adapt this in any way, let alone in this miniseries where the lack of budget is made pretty apparent as the episodes go. I mean, I guess you want to give them props for their ambition, especially since it's a pretty direct adaptation of the story. Like, they don't really go around too much or change too much. It's practically all there, all the way down to the ice cream wrapper hitting her shin and getting stuck there. Just even down to the little details, they adapted this as faithfully as they possibly could for this series. And I don't know if that's for better, if that was a better way to go, or if they would have been worse off trying to kind of use it as a foundation and then jump off into their own thing. I don't know, but yeah, so just starting off from the get-go, we have one decision I kind of liked that the series made when adapting this episode was having her at the police station just sort of bookend it. Like, we get this really brief shot of her at the beginning just looking like she's been through all this, and then it goes into our opening credit sequence, and because in the story it bounces back and forth between what was happening to them and her at the police station trying to relay this back to them as best she can. And it does kind of add something to, I guess, the terror of it, that we're not cutting back and forth in like a certain timeline, how once we follow them all the way, and then it circles back around to the police station. I think that was a good call, but that's probably the best, that's probably the best decision it made, as far as taking its own liberty. But it does have this interesting imagery at the start of it for this little opening credit sequence where we have it's very tone setting, where we get the really nice sort of nature footage, and then the black starts dripping and oozing all over everything. It's sort of like that documentary Microcosmos, just like in hell, is what it basically looks like. And yeah, and that sets up the whole thing of everything will start off nice, and then it's kind of a slow descent, or not so slow descent, into whatever this madness is. And the thing about that, though, is that when we meet this couple, Claire Forlani being the woman, and she's the thing here is that they're so like cutesy in a way, and that I get what they're going for, because it'll be the contrast of, oh, this was their perfect life and this was the perfect direction they were going, and they're the perfect couple and all that, and then this that happens to them is a magnificent contrast to what they had going on. I get that that's the idea. And we kind of got a glimpse of that when we saw the contrast of images during the opening credit sequence, so it all comes together. The trouble is that it makes them so cutesy that it's like they come off almost unnatural. Like they're almost otherworldly in themselves when they're supposed to kind of be the audience surrogate that kind of goes through this, and we feel it because they feel it because we can relate to them. But that's, like I said, they really went off on that, and they almost come off just as weird as the world they eventually find themselves in. And that's, I don't know if that is because Claire Forlani is an actress that has had strong moments in her career for sure, but she also has probably she's probably about 50-50 in that regard, because here it's really, you know, I don't think either one of them are bad actors, but it's in this particular episode, it's one of those cases where you're not quite sure, but with bad dialogue and bad acting, you're not sure where one ends and the other begins, and you're not sure who to blame or where this went wrong, but something went wrong, because this just feels off the whole time. And it's like, especially, there's moments towards the beginning where Forlani basically feels, especially when they're in the cab, it's almost like she's reading off cue cards or something. And it's, like I said, the fact that this is supposed to be the normal part so that we can contrast that with what happens later and making it all the more surreal and otherworldly, where the gears are kind of falling apart pretty early before we even get to when it really takes off. So you can pretty much pinpoint where the good ideas are and where the good moments are, because this was, as far as the short story goes, it's one that kind of had to grow on me. But it's one of those things that kind of in retrospect, and you start to kind of take in, especially when you watch the adaptation they did for the miniseries, you start to see the real strengths, which we just talked about with Grandma and Mercy the last time we did this. It's pretty much the same thing here, where we've got some stuff that seems outlandish in the story, but once you realize the feel King is going for and the way he, like, brings us into it without much fanfare, like, it's just kind of, we're just kind of slowly eased into the surreal, and that's what makes it feel, makes that effect happen. Because here we've got, like, when she sees the rat heads on the bikers, and you read that in the story, it's kind of a hard thing to imagine right away, because it feels so outlandish. But then when you see the way the miniseries pulls it off, or doesn't pull it off, I guess, they get halfway. Because you can get I feel like you could get much more of a sense of what King was going for if the miniseries had made that shot more brief, where it's like they're driving by in the cab, and then she looks out the window, and then as they pass by, they take on, like, their faces take on this rat-like structure of sorts. And it stays on that to show the audience how scary everything is. And then when they kind of turn the corner, she looks again, and they're normal again. And it's like, if they had done that really briefly to where we, the audience, aren't quite sure we saw what we saw, I feel like that would be much more of what King was going for. But the fact that it lingered because they wanted to show the audience the effect that they had, and wanted the audience to make sure we knew exactly what she was seeing. And it's like, if it had been more like a Flash, I feel like that would have been much more in the surreal line of what the story's going for. But we've got to show off our TV budget, which, as we learn, may have been better off doing more of a less is more sort of approach, but yeah. Another approach that I do like, though, that the adaptation did, a change that it made, was how we get a lot of the possible background on what's going on through the cops. And it's like they're talking about the druids and stuff like that. And there's even the moment in the story where one of the cops thinks about the other, how the hell does he know that? Like, what are the odds that he would know something like that? And I like the idea that they give that to the cab driver, and the story kind of takes on this whole old-fashioned approach of like the old-fashioned warnings and stuff like that, where they say, you know, oh, stay away from there and stuff like that. It's a cliche, sure, but in the right context, it can still work, especially kind of giving you that nostalgic old horror vibe. But I also like a lot that in the story that we just kind of fall into it without much warning. Like, the first thing she sees, obviously, is that headline that freaks her out. And then it just kind of slowly becomes, like, each thing she sees is weirder than the last, and it's just kind of this descent into it. And, like I said, the way we're eased into it, I think, makes the surreal quality a bit more... because it's when you fall into it unexpectedly, because you've got the warning signs. They're like, not only are they warning them to stay away from Crouch-In, but it's like they're also warning the audience, hey, you're about to see weird shit. But if you're not told ahead of time you're about to see weird shit, that's definitely more in line with how I feel like the main characters in the story went into this, and how we probably should have as well, because the effect is much more apparent there. But instead we get stuff like... And I think it really just comes down to I think their budgetary restraints and the fact that they can't use, I guess, I don't know if it's time constraints or budget constraints or both, that they have to settle on this really shoddy CGI over something a bit more practical. So we get stuff like, they could totally be unsettling like it is in the story, like the cat's face and its eye in particular. And instead we've got this CGI monstrosity just kind of pasted over an actual cat that is blatantly obvious and is like the main sort of scare point of this. Like, it's the thing that keeps coming back in the story and keeps wrapping it around, and it's... yeah, that's gonna be... But even more so, I think the moment that the episode really shits the bed the most is not surprising, because we've talked about it a few times in this series now, and that is these straight-to-video-ass directors. Like I said, I feel like all straight-to-video directors went to the same goddamn school and used the same shitty goddamn techniques, if you want to call them techniques. The jerky camera movement and zooming in and out and getting a little fuzzy and blurry and all that is when you know shit is going down. Because God forbid they don't just straight up tell us, hey, shit is going down. So when we get this moment when he goes on the other side of the bushes and the hole is there and they hear the moaning and she starts to freak out, it goes into that. The jerky camera movements, the zooming in and out and stuff like that, and it's like, once again, the whole surreal factor, the only way that's gonna work is if we, the audience, actually feel like it's happening to us. And like I said, if we just eased into it and things got progressively weirder as it went without calling attention to themselves. But now, things don't even have to call attention to themselves because you've got a shitty director and shitty camera work and all that other stuff blatantly telling you when things are severe now. And the effect is not there whatsoever because all you're thinking about is how shitty this looks. So the effect is pretty much gone entirely. So, and you've got moments in here where, like, it is interesting when you see it in a screen form, where it's obviously he was going for the Lovecraft thing the whole time, but you can also get a sense of, like, while there's also that, there's also past King as well. Like, there's the moment when they're just sort of walking through the town by themselves. You don't really get much of this vibe in the story because it's so focused on the surroundings. But when you actually see on screen the two of them in the middle of this seemingly dead town, it feels like shots right out of Children of the Corn. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, but if so, it's... I guess that's just... And that would be like a significantly more subtle homage compared to them just outright saying, hey, we're doing Lovecraft stuff, as you can see. We're even using some terminology. It's... yeah, but... and then I think another thing that comes to mind is the use of colors in the story, where that's... And she even mentions that, like, specifically when she's at the police station, where she says, you know, the colors were different, the angles were different. It was like being on another planet. But when she actually describes the colors, like, the sun and all that, and the purple of the sky, and how dooming that felt, and how you can imagine that in such this surreal way, the idea that the episode had was to drain the color the more it went on, which I could see working in another context. Like, if it was its own story, I could see that being effective. But the fact that you're taking something that really, really works in the thing you're adapting, and you do the opposite. See, even if it would be effective in another context, it feels kind of counterproductive to just do the opposite of what was already working when you're adapting something. And I don't think the draining of the color works near as well as the way the colors are described in the story. So, but once again, that's all like, what was in their budget, what wasn't, I don't know. So yeah, that's pretty much the extent of it. We've also got the sort of embarrassing overuse of British speak, I guess you would call it, that's immediately apparent in the story, where it's like, it almost comes off like parody. But, and that carries over into the story as well. So there's some portions of the story that maybe don't quite work or feel unnatural, that for some reason did carry over. But a lot of the stuff that they could have, tried to, like, the way they tried to do their own thing with stuff, but they were still trying to stay in the confines of what they had, you can see where these might have worked in another scenario, but when you're already familiar with the story and that's the story being adapted, it's just a matter of, like we talked about before, like with the fifth quarter, like how much it matters to you if they adapt it as directly as possible. Like I said, if the story works as is, what do you need to change? Why don't you work on changing the stuff that doesn't work, like the British speak and stuff like that? So that's pretty much where they ended up with this. And like I said, another underwhelming entry from this miniseries, but maybe they get better, maybe not. We'll find out soon enough. But I think the next thing we're going to do is go back into a portion of a movie, and we'll touch on those in a couple. We're going back to Night Shift again, and we're touching on a couple of stories there, and then we'll come back to the miniseries and see if things get better or not. So yeah, so there's going to be a few verses coming and a review video finally, with a few things on it, and we'll continue this King thing. We're getting closer to the end, and we'll get into more probably recognizable movies as we get towards the very end of it. So that's the plan anyway. So until we get to all that stuff, I think that's it for this.